him. Hopefully he'll join us tomorrow. We are on Daf Mem Zayin today, and we are at the top of the page. First word on the page, very, very clean. And we're going to finish a parak. Remember the discussion, so it's really the tail end of a parak, has been talking about the different requirements of the Nazir when they become tahar. And remember, there are 3 carbonot that are brought. We went through the whole process of how you prepare and boil it and cook it and wave it, et cetera, and which point, where are you supposed to cut your hair? What's ma'akev? All those questions yesterday, or not yesterday, but for a week, basically. Says the last Mishnah of the parak, first word on Daf Mem Zayin, Misha Nizrak alav echa min hadamim. You do all your carbonot, you do everything right, you cut your hair, they have your carbonot, you're ready for your big after party, right? Your big Nazir after party. You zorek one of the blood of one of the 3 carbonot, and then you become tamei. So you made it, you got to the last day, you did everything right, and then unfortunately it fell apart. Rebbe Eliezer Omer Soter Takol. Later says the whole thing is for naught, because, and we'll see what this means. We've had Rebbe Eliezer before. Everything is ma'akev. Until you've done basically the whole thing, you're not done. And so this basically cancels, we think it means here cancels your Nazirut. We're going to see it doesn't mean that at all, but that's what we think it means. The Chachamim Omrim Yavi Shar Karbanatov Yitar. Chachamim say, no, you did one, you're already sort of at the finish line. You got to bring your other carbanots once you're tahar, and then you're done. Amru lo, in fact, the Chachamim said to Rebbe Eliezer, Maaseh, there was a very famous story, everybody knows the case, it was all over the newspapers, of Miriam HaTarmudit, a woman named Miriam from Tarmud. I don't exactly know if you say where Tarmud is, but it's, a location, a place. Right, so Miriam HaTarmudit, she was very famously a Nazira, and she went and did all her carbanots, right, and everything went right. Hold on. And then on the last day, she brought her carbonot, and what happened was, they had already been zorek, one of the blood for one of the carbonot, they came and told her, she's there maybe in the Beit HaMikdash, and they said, unfortunately, her daughter is very sick. So she went to visit her daughter, and she died in her hands. Whatever, that obviously doesn't say she died in her hands, but she went and found her daughter, and she was not alive, and so she was tamei mate to her daughter, right? The Amru, so obviously this was a very sad and prominent story. The Amru Chachamim tavi shar karbonotev v'titar. Chachamim said, it's sorry, we're sad, but it doesn't cancel her Nazirut. She should bring the rest of her carbonot, and then she will become tahar from her Nazirut. So that's the machloket, Rebbe Eliezer and the Chachamim. Ketani. Now says the Gemara, Rebbe Eliezer says, Soter Takol, that if you become tamei at the end of your Nazirut, after you've already finished all the days and you've brought the carbonot, and they just haven't sprinkled the blood of all of them, cancel everything. Sorry?
You don't have to redo it. You don't have to wait 7 days and then.
So no, you do have to wait 7, because you can't bring a carbon if you're tamei.
Right.
So
No.
when they say yavi carbonotov, it means you wait 7 days, you become tahar, then you bring the rest of your carbonot. Correct. So Rebbe Eliezer says it cancels everything. It says in where, how could that be? But Rebbe Eliezer, kol achar meleit shiva soter. Remember, we had this way back in the beginning of the Masechah, and we've discussed it many times. A special halacha that if let's say a person's a Nazir and they become tamei in the middle of the Nazirut, it might cancel the whole thing. But if they cancel on the last day, what we call Yom Maleit, the concluding day of your Nazirut. And to be clear, here, this is sort of beyond your concluding day, right? You're beyond your 30 days, or maybe it's the end of it, you're bringing your carbonot. So once you get to that point, you only cancel 7 days. Remember, we said earlier, canceling 7 days doesn't mean you're Nazir for 7 days. It means you got to wait 7 days to become tahar, and then you finish your stuff. So why would it cancel the whole thing? Amarav, no. In fact, my soter nami t'kam Rebbe Eliezer, it means soter karbonotav. Doesn't mean it cancels your Nazirut, right? And obviously it doesn't mean it cancels 7 days, because the Chachamim also cancel 7 days, right? Because you'd have to wait 7 days, like Miriam just said, for the Chachamim to bring your carbon anyways. It means you canceled your carbonot. According to Rebbe Eliezer, if you brought 1 carbon or even 2 carbonot and then became tamei, you have to do those over again, right? You have to wait 7 days, become tahar, and bring all the carbonot again, because it's a package. You can't bring 1 now and 1 in a week. Again, it's not the time that's the problem, it's the truma that's the problem. So it's soter karbonotav. And says the Gemara, "Achinami mistavra." If you look at the words, this actually makes a lot of sense. The Ketani v'Chachamim omrim tavi shar karbanoteha v'titar. Right, and the Chachamim's response doesn't emphasize the days, emphasize the other karbanot. The Chachamim say, no, bring the rest of your karbanot and you'll become tahar. Not that you change anything in the days, but that it doesn't cancel what you've done already. You can bring, let's say you brought the shlamim, you became tamei, just bring the chatat and the ola afterwards and you'll be okay. And in fact, Masanami, the Miriam Tarmudit, Shnizrak Aleh Chamin Adamim, Ubal V'Hodio Al Bita Shaita Misukenet, just recording over the Mishnah, the story of Miriam Tarmudit. They told her daughter was ill, Halcha Matzah Shemeta, Amru Chachamim. Again, the words here that we're quoting are these words, Tavi Shar Karbonota V'Titar Shmamina. That in fact, what you have to do is bring the rest of the karbonot. You don't have to bring any new ones. The one you already did counted, wait 7 days, come tahar, and bring the rest of your karbonot, and that's the opinion of the Chachamim. The Rashi has a whole nother, the Pirush Mefarish has a whole nother pshat, that maybe it actually is not referring even to the karban that you already brought, it's referring to the karbanot that you separated, right? Meaning you put aside 3 animals for these karbanot, and then you brought one and became tamei. Maybe what Rebbe Eliezer is saying is that the other 2 don't count, because they were set aside before the tumah. You have to bring 3 new animals, basically. So it'd be a lot more expensive then, not just 2 new animals, 3 new animals. But the way I said it is the first shot, and either way. Okay, starting a new parak Kohen Gadol v'Nazir, which is a very interesting parak. Says the Mishnah, we've been discussing Nazir up till now for the last 6 or 7 weeks. And of course, one of the important details of a Nazir is that they can't become tamei. But I'm sure everyone has thought at some point that this parallels a Kohen Gadol, where the Torah in Parshat Emor is very concerned about Tumah and Tahara of a Kohen in general, and a Kohen Gadol specifically, right? And a Kohen is not supposed to become Tamei to anybody. The Pasuk gives exceptions, Aviv, Imo, Achiv, Achuto, right? There's 7 exceptions as we have. And the Kohen Gadol has no exceptions, basically, right? So says our Mishnah, Kohen Gadol v'Nazir, both a Kohen Gadol in his category and a Nazir in their category, ein mitamin likrovehem. They cannot become tamei to any of their relatives. The prohibition of tumah applies even if a person's child or parent dies. They're not allowed to become tamei and attend to them in their death. Now, the most of them, everyone, not maybe not everyone, but the next words probably don't belong here. And we'll see in the Gemara.
Wait, but except if there's absolutely no one to take care of them, right?
Well, our Mishnah in front of us says Alva mitamim lemeit mitzvah. So most take out those words. We'll see why. It's true. No one disagrees with that. But it seems from the Gemara that those words were not here, because the Gemara is going to try to prove that. Okay. That they can. But yes, the fact is true that if there's a meit mitzvah, and meit mitzvah again is a very interesting topic, right? But a meit mitzvah is a person who died and doesn't have anyone to take care of them. Whether that means there's no one immediately available to take care of them, there's no one, there's no one ever to take care of them. Can you hire someone? Like, how far away? Like, what exactly is a meit mitzvah? And what does take care of them mean, right? What's the minimum number of people? Like, all these are questions that have a lot of practical implication, of course, right? If a person's a Kohen, they're not supposed to become tamei. They should be tamei to a meit mitzvah. But the question is, what does a meit mitzvah mean? But that is an exception, and we'll see in the Gemara that's an exception in both of these cases. Now, continues the Mishnah. Let's say, I love this Mishnah, a Kohen Gadol and a Nazir are traveling down the road, right? They're carpooling together. Umatzum meit mitzvah. And of course, as you would like, as the Mishnah always loves to set up these cases, they find no one else in the car, presumably, and they find a meit mitzvah. So the question is, who should become tamei to this meit mitzvah? Again, assuming you only need one person, because if you needed both, there'd be no question. And if they were traveling alone, there would be no question. They definitely take care of the mate. But you've got 2 people. So which one's tum'ah is more important, let's say, or which one's tahara is more important? Let's put it that way. Says the Mishnah, Yohalchim b'derech u'matzum meit mitzvah. Rebbe Eliezer says, Yitzma Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol should become Tamei, v'al Yitzma Nazir. The Nazir should stay Tahor. So the Kohen Gadol should go and take care of it, and the Nazir should stay out of the picture. The Chachamim Omrim, the opposite. Yitzma Nazir, v'al Yitzma Kohen Hadyot. well, actually, it's the wrong word. Kohen Gadol is what it should say, right? The Nazir should, it didn't make any sense, right? The Nazir should become Tameh and not the Kohen Gadols. The Girsa is changed here to Kohen Gadol, okay?
Well, here, the way that Art Scroll actually translated is that even an ordinary Kohen should not become Tameh.
So there's different Girsaot, right? But correct, but yes, but what the Chachamim are saying is true about both. That is correct. That a Nazir, but not a Kohen. But I mean, the Girsa on my side at least changes to Kohen Gadol here, because that's the context, right? Amar lahem Rebbe Eliezer. Now, what's the rationale? Why would one be more? How would you choose Kohen Gadol or Nazir? Says Rebbe Eliezer, it makes a lot of sense to me. Yitzma Kohen Gadol. Why should the Kohen Gadol be Tamei? She'eno mevi karban al tumato. Look, the Torah says to Kohen Gadol, don't become Tamei. It's true about any Kohen, right? But if a Kohen Gadol becomes Tamei, there's no extra carbon. There's no special sacrifice that he brings. But by a Nazir, of course, a Nazir is not supposed to come Tamei. And if they do, they bring a sacrifice. So why is it that, it's clearly a Nazir is more holy or more important, their Tumah, than a Kohen Gadol. So therefore the Nazir should not be Mitamei and the Kohen Gadol should be Mitamei. Right? Itma Kohen she'eno mevi karban al tumato. He doesn't bring a karban for becoming tamei. Va'itma Nazir shu mevi karban al tumato. But you shouldn't have the Nazir become tamei. He does bring a karban for his tumato. Amru lo, the Chachamim said back to Rebbe Eliezer, we have a different svar. Yitman Nazir she'ein kedushato kedushat olam. Right? A Nazir is something that you're not born as a Nazir, and you don't remain a Nazir for life. Now, the reality is you could make yourself a Nazir for life, but that's not, it's not the typical Nazir. And even then, the Nazirut is something that you apply, basically. It's something that you is not forever. But a Kohen, of course, is forever. And now, the Kohen Gadol also, once you become Kohen Gadol, is sort of forever, but even a Kohen is forever, right? So it's Kedushato, Kedushat Olam, Vayitzma Kohen, Shekedushato, Kedushat Olam, right? A Nazir is not, in Kedushato, Kedushat Olam, and a Kohen has Kedusha that's innate to the Kohen and therefore is of a higher level. So that's the machloket in the Mishnah. We're going to discuss it, of course, in the Gemara. Bishlama, says Gemara, I understand, this is a strange use of Bishlama, but the sense here is, I take for granted the following rules, right? Now we're going to go through a hierarchy of two people walking down a road, which one should become Tameh, okay? So these are, again, the question really always comes to, if any of the individuals was alone, and it's a Neit Mitzvah, you're supposed to become Tameh, right? But what happens if there's two people and one has a different level of Kedusha than the other? And again, Kedusha here is not holy in general, right? It's specifically for the issue of mate, right? Because a Nazir, is not better in some ways than many other people from a Kedusha standpoint, but from a prohibition of being Tameh, Nazir is a very high level of prohibition, partly from the proof that you have to bring a karban if you do it, right? So, says the Gemara, let's go through some scenarios. Bishlama, I understand, or I would assume, that if you have a Kohen Gadol, the Nazir, right? So that's the first case in our Mishnah. A Kohen Gadol and a Nazir are walking down the road. Hi, Savar. Now, of course, that's a machloket in our Mishnah, so we don't have a conclusion. One Tana holds Kohen Gadol Adif, as we learned in our Mishnah. Hi, Savar Nazir Adif. Right, that's the machloket in the Mishnah. So that case is unresolved. The second case is, what if you have one Kohen Gadol who's Mashuach b'Shemen HaMishcha, a Kohen Gadol who became Kohen Gadol because he was anointed with the Shemen HaMishcha, right? The Torah talks about anointing Aaron to be Kohen Gadol. That's the traditional way they would anoint the Kohanim Gedolim. But there was a point in the according to the story tradition that the Shemen HaMishcha was lost or was nignaz, it was hidden maybe, right? And there's no more Shemen HaMishcha. And we derive that even then you could make someone a Kohen Gadol by them being appointed and putting on this 8 begadim of the Kohen Gadol, right? The Kohen Gadol wears 4 special begadim, we just had, and the Kohen Gadol wears 8. So there's a concept of what's called meruba begadim, right? So a Kohen Gadol, who's a Kohen Gadol by virtue of the fact that they didn't get Shemen HaMishcha, but they put on the begadim. So let's say you have 2 Kohanim Gedolim. Now, Tosfos, of course, and everyone is very bothered. How could you have 2 Kohanim Gedolim? So we're going to see in the next case, and if you recall from Masechet Yuma, right, there wasn't an unfrequent phenomena that a Kohen Gadol was shunted aside, right? And that is for a few reasons, but one might be because the Kohen Gadol could disappear, let's just say, but more likely the Kohen Gadol could become Tameh, right? And remember the case in Masechet Yuma was that you assign a new person to be Kohen Gadol in case the Kohen Gadol is Ro'ek Keri, right? They see an emission that makes them Tameh. There's many other ways to become Tameh, right? You could touch a dead body, and then a Kohen Gadol can also become Pasul if they break their hand or if they become a Mum, let's say, so there are many scenarios in which a Kohen Gadol could be temporarily unavailable for Avodah, and then they would elevate a new person to be the Kohen Gadol. As we learn there, what's usually happens is that once the Kohen Gadol comes back, the new person is called Mashuach Sha'avar. They're called the anointed one in the past, meaning they get deposed, they go down. You can't have two Kohanim Gedolim. But once you remember, we had the principle Ma'alim B'Kodesh Ein Moridim. Once you're called to, once you wear the hat, you can't take it off. And so that person has this sort of in between, they call it a Kohen Gadol Emeritus, I guess, right? So you had something in the past. In fact, you're really Kohen Hadyot, but in some ways we treat you a little bit better. So, but that, of course, is not two Kohanim Gedolim. That's one acting and one past Kohen Gadol. How do you have a scenario where you have two Kohanim Gedolim? So Tosfos raises a very interesting point, and Tosfos here says that it's possible that you could actually have a scenario where you don't make the new Kohen Gadol who's taking over for someone step down. Like, let's say Tosfos says it's a very long time, right? Someone gets sick, they go away, or they're exiled. 10 years pass, and there's a Kohen Gadol in between, right? So as long as the first Kohen Gadol is alive, you're probably still interim, but you could be interim for a decade. Then the Kohen Gadol shows back up. They're not just going to get rid of that person. So then it might be a scenario where you actually have two Kohanim Gedolim. You have two people in service. So let's say you're in that situation, but they were anointed in different ways, right? One was anointed with oil, which is the authentic way, and one was Meruba Bigadim. Says the Gemara on the top of Mem Zayin Amabet, the third word, Meshuach b'shemen hamishcha adif. That one, in fact, is more special or more preferable, and therefore should not become tamei, because there is, in fact, a halacha that differentiates that Kohen Gadol. De'ilo Meshuach b'shemen hamishcha mevi par habal kol mitzvot. There's a special pasuk that talks about if a Kohen Gadol does a sin because he interpreted the halacha wrong, and it turns out it's basically a chatat. Usually, if you do a sin, you bring a regular karban called a seira or kispa, like a female goat, right? Most people. A kohen who is mashuach, kohen hamashuach, brings a par, brings a bull, right? Now that's only true about kohen hamashuach, right? Only a kohen who was anointed, not a kohen who's a kohen gadol based on wearing the begadim. So ilo mashuach b'shemen hamishcha mevi par ba'al kol mitzvot. The Meshuach brings this special par for doing an Avera, that's I call mitzvah, meaning any mitzvah that you go against. V'ilu meruba begadim ein mevi Meshuach, ein mevi, right, period. So therefore, the Kohen Gadol who is anointed is precedent to the Kohen Gadol who just wore more clothing, and that's what I mean, meruba begadim. So that's that case. And again, we're not asking questions. We're just sort of logically going through and trying to understand these people. The fourth line is, let's say, you have what I just described to you before. You have a Kohen Gadol who's Mashuach Sha'avar, right? You have a Kohen Gadol who is anointed. So again, the case is this. Kohen Gadol A is a Kohen. He becomes sick, let's say. So they anoint a second person to take over. And then the Kohen Gadol A comes back. And so the B, second person, is called Mashuach Sha'avar. He was anointed, but he's no longer the Kohen Gadol. It was just a temporary fill-in, right? So for the rest of his life, he's going to be called Mashuach Sha'avar. 5 years later, the Kohen Gadol dies, let's say. And then they appoint a new Kohen Gadol who is not the Mashuach Sha'avar, right? They appoint someone totally different. But as the Gemara points out, they ran out of Shemen HaMishcha. They lost it. So the new Kohen Gadol became a Kohen Gadol through Meruba Begadim. And now he's walking down the street next to another man who was once a Kohen Gadol based on anointing. So, right, one is active, but he's only used begadim, ruba begadim. One is a past Kohen Gadol, but he became Kohen Gadol through anointing. So which one takes precedence, right? A great Gemara question. So fourth line, Meshuach Sha'avar, one is the Kohen Gadol who was Meshuach, but is a past Kohen Gadol, and one is Meruba begadim. Says the Gemara, it's no question really, because one is really Kohen Gadol and one is not, right? It doesn't matter that one had Shemen HaMishcha and one didn't. The Meruba begadim adif, He's the one who actually is the Kohen Gadol. He's the one working in the Beit HaMikdash, right? So that's what takes precedence. And of course, part of the Truma question is that if you become Tameh, you can't do the Avodah, right? So part of the reason, or maybe the main reason you don't become Tameh is so you can be available for service. So it's much more important that the one who is actively serving the Beit HaMikdash remain Tahor. So that's how we would say it there, right? Right? The Meshuach Shavar is not a Kohen Gadol. He cannot do the work of a Kohen Gadol. But what about, one more case, or a couple more cases. Avar Machmat Kiryo. Let's say a person's a Kohen Gadol, but he is Baal Keri, which means he's Tameh for one day. So for that day, he has to take off his Kohen Gadol outfit and wear his regular outfit, right? Because he can't work in the Beit HaMikdash. He gets sent home for the day, right? And there's another Kohen Gadol got sent home because he has a mum. He developed an injury that makes him impossible to be a Kohen, right? He broke it, or to work in the Mikdash. So yeah, there's got to be a third one standing in. You always have to have a backup. I don't know. Right. You can imagine any day you could be out. So they had fill-ins, right? So you have two temporarily deposed Kohanim Gedolim, right? One is Avar, he's been deposed Machmat Kiryo because he's Tameh, and one is Avar Machmat Mumo because he's got a broken shoulder, which is, let's say, permanent. Says Avar Machmat Kiryo Adif. If they're walking down the road, you would prefer the one who is the Kohen Gadol, who had Roa Keri, not to become Tameh. Dilo Hai Chazila Avodah Machar, right? Because this one he need him to work tomorrow. So it's true that today he can't work. But we know when it's ending, the one who's got a mum is either never going to be chazi or it's going to take much longer till he's chazi. Okay, so that's that. So those are all the cases which seem to us to be very clear. But now we've got a question. They asked the following question. Let's say you have a kohen who's mashuach milchama. Now, mashuach milchama is not a position that most people talk about a lot. It is in the Torah, though. And then the Torah is, and all the details are not in the Torah, but the concepts in the Torah, that basically, in addition to a regular role of the Kohanim, which is to work in the Beit HaMikdash, there's this funny and interesting role that they would anoint a person. And in the Gemara, in Hariot and elsewhere, we talk about this as being really equivalent to Kohen Gadol, meaning they would wear the clothing of Kohen Gadol. They would act in many ways like they can't become Tameh. They can't marry the people that Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry, these kind of things. But the person is appointed to exhort the people to go to war, right? We talk about Pinchas being that person in the Torah, where you make the announcement, you talk to the people, and you encourage them, and you purify them, and you send home the people who shouldn't be there, anyone who's scared, right? There's a whole speech that they give, Kol Yareh, V'lach Levav, anyone who's scared should go back home, etc. So that person is called Mashuach Milchama. They're anointed essentially as an equivalent to Kohen Gadol for war. Now, although I say it's equivalent, they're not really Kohen Gadol. They can't do service in the Beit HaMikdash like the Kohen Gadol. But they do have a role, and they have many halachot like the Kohen Gadol. So let's say you have that person, Mashuach Milchama, walking down the road, and next to them is the Sgan. Now, Sgan is a little bit of a made-up position because the Torah does not talk about Sgan Kohen Gadol. Sgan literally means vice principal, right? Vice president. So they would often, we talk about this, a Kohen Gadol in waiting, right? In case the Kohen Gadol became Tameh. So the Sgan was the assistant. So you have someone who's the assistant. He's not a Kohen Gadol anyway, but he's in waiting, essentially, on deck, right? And you have a Meshuach Milchama, who in many ways is a Kohen Gadol, but not in service in terms of war. So which one is Adif? Okay, that's the question. Meshuach Milchama, Uskan, Pai Minayo Adif. Says the Gemara, the way we would resolve this is Meshuach Milchama Adif. In fact, we should prefer not to have the Meshuach Milchama become Tameh, because he's got a job right now. His job is to work for the war effort, right? The Sgan has a future job. He's going to fill in if you need him, but right now he's not filling in for anything, right? So says the Gemara, Meshuach Milchama Adif Techazi de Milchama. That's one concept. Odilmar, perhaps Sgan Adif Techazi de Avodah. Right, when the Sgan is needed, it's going to be for work in the Beit HaMikdash. The Meshuach Milchama is not a fill-in for working in the Beit HaMikdash. He has a role only in supporting the war effort. So which one is preferable? That's the question. Tashma. Says, well, we can derive this from a Braita. There's a Mishnah, actually, a Braita, though, in Masechet Hariot, which says, Ein bein mashuach milchama liskan. There's no difference. This doesn't mean there's no difference. There's a lot of differences, but there's no kula. There's nothing less about a mashuach milchama to a skan, the two people we're talking about. Ella, says the Braita, Shemhaya mahalchin b'derech umatzu meit mitzvah, and answers our question. They're walking down the road. You've got a Kohen Gadol, who's not a real Kohen Gadol, but a Kohen Gadol for war, and you have a skan, an assistant, on-deck Kohen Gadol, who are walking down the road. They find a meit mitzvah, yitama mashuach milchama. Says the Braita, the Kohen for the war should become tamei first. V'al yitama haskan, because the skan, as we resolved it, the skan is going to work in the Beit HaMikdash, and we need him to be tahar, and therefore you should avoid him becoming tamei. Says that's a very nice answer, but there's another Braita which says, Hatanya is a Braita that specifically says that mashuach milchama kodem l'skan, that when you're evaluating people, this is a very tricky Braita, right? When you're ranking people's importance to the community, and the context there is where you have a building that collapses and you have to decide who you're going to save first, right? Which person to dig out first, which is, of course, a very tricky question, right? If you could do both, you do both. But let's say you have to decide who you go first. Says the Braita, then you go first for the Mashuach Milchama. So that implies that that's a more important person than the Skan. Amar Mar Zutra, no, that's the Inyan Hachyoto. That's in terms of saving their life. So there, Mashuach Milchama Adif. There you do, if you have to save a life first of, two people are drowning, you got to jump in and save one of them first, you should go for the Mashuach Milchama. Why? My taima, the Talobe Rabin, because that person fulfills a function for the community. They're critical to the war effort. They inspire and lead many, many people. And so you should save them first, which again, very complicated discussion about saving one person over another, right? But that should be the case when you're talking about saving a life. Laying in tum'ah, when you're talking about which person should become tamei, they're not going to die, right? They're going to touch a meit mitzvah. So then skan adif, then the skan should go first, meaning he's not to go first. He shouldn't become tamei. He's more important, and the Mashuach Milchama should become tamei instead of the skan. And that's the Tanya, as we learned in a Braita, Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos Omer. Remember, Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos, very, very early Tana, as we all know from Pirkei Avot, right? One of the very early Zugot. Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos said, Lama tiknu skan the Kohen Gadol. Why did they make up this position? Right? Torah does not describe an assistant Kohen Gadol. Right? Why did the Chachamim make up this position of skan Kohen Gadol, which, as you probably recall, we've quoted many, many times. Right, Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim, of course, is very famous, right? So why do they make up this position? It's because if there is a psul of the Kohen Gadol, then this person will fill in. And so when you're talking about things that have to do with life and saving them, the Mashuach Milchama is a more important position. He's a person who serves the public, who helps lead the war effort, leads the war effort. They're a very critical person. If you're going to save a life, you got to go for them first. Right? But when you're talking specifically about who should be mitamei to a meit mitzvah, then the Kohen, who's the Mashuach Milchama, should go first, because the skan is more important for them to be tahar in order to do the avodah if needed. And that's how we resolve that. Oh boy. Okay, let's continue. 10 lines from the bottom and do just the last case. Says the Gemara. Now, if you look at our Mishnah, right now, this is why Tosfos says the Girsa clearly in our Mishnah has to be Kohen Gadol v'Nazir im mitamei lekrovehem, and stop there, period. Right? Because according to Tosfot, then now the Gemara is saying, the Mishnah says they shouldn't become tamei to their relatives. Now, quote our Gemara, Ad kan lo pligi, they only disagree, about meit mitzvah, ella when there's a Kohen Gadol and a Nazir together. Kika azli ba'adi hadadi. Right? They're going together. There's a machloket in our Mishnah, who should become tamei first, the Kohen Gadol or the Nazir? Aval chad l'chudei. If each one is walking down the road by themselves, meaning there's only one of them, either a Nazir or a Kohen Gadol, they should become tamei, right? How do we know that? Which is why, again, in the words in the Mishnah, make this diak make no sense, right? Because we're now deriving, if they're going together, then there's a fight, but by themselves they should become tamei, implying those words were not in the Mishnah. But the halacha is clearly true, that both the Kohen Gadol and a Nazir should become tamei to a meit mitzvah. How do we know that, right? How do we know that? Minani mili. Says Gemara to Tanura Banan, it's based on the following Braita. What does the Braita say? It says in the pasuk, and this is talking about a Kohen Gadol, Al kol nafshot meit lo yavo. Kohen Gadol should not become tamei to any, it's a funny terminology, of course, nafshot meit, right? Any dead soul, right? It's dead by then. And then the next words say, la'aviv u'le'imo. It goes through his relatives, right? Says before you get to the next words, if it had just said to Kohen Gadol, don't become tamei, what would I have thought that means, right? Bima katuv midaber. What's the pasuk referring to? Iber chokim. If it's referring to strangers, right, saying don't become tamei to someone you are not related to, why does the Torah need to tell me that Kohen Gadol shouldn't become tamei? Kal v'chomer. It's something that Tosfos is not really kal v'chomer, but it's like it's a guaranteed knowledge. Ma Kohen Hedyot. Right, think about it. Kohen Hedyot is mitamei lekrovim. Kohen Hedyot is allowed to mitamei to his mother, father, or sibling, right? But Eino mitamei l'rechokim, it can't be mitamei to a stranger. So certainly a Kohen Gadol is a Kohen Hedyot also, right? He's not less. So Kohen Gadol she'eino mitamei l'krovim, Eino din she'eino mitamei l'rechokim. He certainly, we're going to see, can't be. Now Tosfos points out we don't know this yet, right? We're saying who do we know about a Kohen Gadol, right? So these words we're just using it as a literary kind of terminology. But basically, a Kohen Gadol who's also a Kohen Hedyot certainly can't be mitamei to strangers, to rechokim. So when the Torah comes and says to Kohen Gadol, don't become tamei, it must be adding people to who we already know. Who is it adding? Let's presume it's adding his relatives, right? Ella b'krovim hakatuv midaber. So the Torah is adding his relatives, saying a Kohen Gadol should not become tamei, even to people who are related to him. Okay, that's fine. But then the next words are, and not to his father, ula aviv. But why does it have to say that? I already know his father, because it can't mean anyone, it must mean his relatives. So it says the Braita, it's telling you this specific chiddush, that it's only his father who he can't become, and relatives who he can't become tamei to. La'avivu de'eno mitamei, ha mitamei hu l'meit mitzvah. When we say a Kohen Gadol can't become tamei, and we know it means relatives, but says the Gemara, it means only relatives are a problem. There's a category of people that a Kohen Gadol can become tamei to. And who's that category? It's a meit mitzvah. So now again, the pasuk doesn't say meit mitzvah, but it says leaving someone out. And by leaving someone out, it gives us room to say that a Kohen Gadol can be mitamei to a meit mitzvah. And so we will stop there because it's the last word on the page. Tomorrow we're going to do two things, God willing, many things actually, but two of them that we're going to do is, first of all, we have to ask about a Nazir, right? That's a Kohen Gadol. How do we know a Nazir? But before we even get to a Nazir, we're going to keep darshaning this pasuk, because the pasuk continues and it says that Kohen Gadol al kol nafshot meit lo yavo. He shouldn't become tamei la'aviv, which we just darshan to tell you, not his father, but he can be tamei to a meit mitzvah. The next pasuk says le'imo, and not to his mother, right? What does that tell you? So we're going to learn that tomorrow. And of course, we'll get further into this discussion about meit mitzvah. What time are we going to learn tomorrow, Miriam? PM?
I'm free until 8:15 a.m., but I'm happy to do it in the evening. So we're changing the clock tonight.
I know, I'm aware.
Okay.
What works better, Robert? What about you? What's your vote?
Tomorrow I'm going to be traveling between Lakewood and Brooklyn. If I miss it live, I'll catch the recording.
Okay. Is there any time that would be preferable for you, live or not really? So you want to do the morning? Would that be easier? I'm okay with either one, of course.
For me personally, probably the morning would be the best.
Okay, then we're going to say we'll do 7:45, Miriam. We'll be done by 8:15. It's not, these dapim are very short.
We'll do 7:45.
Yeah, we'll be done by 8:15. Don't worry.
I mean, I might be a few minutes late because we daven here in Lakewood at 7, and we end approximately 7:45.
Well, we're gonna do 7:45. We'll catch everyone. If you're late, we'll try to catch you up. And I hope everyone will wake up, even though we're changing the plans, right?
Right.
So, hopefully, no one's sleeping in.
I also understand starting next week you'll be doing.
Yeah. So Shabbat we're gonna do it in person. I know that leaves you out. So we'll figure out a way. I'm gonna think about it.
Okay. What I'll do is I'll just catch I'll catch Rabbi Stefanski or one of the other.
Got it.
Daf Yomi that are available one day every week.
Okay. I wish we had another solution, but let's keep thinking. Okay, sounds wonderful. So tomorrow morning I'll put it on 7:45 a.m.
Great. Thank you, Ellie.
Shabbat tov.
Shabbat tov. Good night.